Hello. This is my report or discussion on Chapter 7 of Sullivan's book titled Urban Economics. So I was assigned Chapter 7, which corresponds to land use patterns. All right. Um, in metropolitan areas, jobs are divided between central business districts, suburban subcenters, and everywhere else. So most jobs are elsewhere, widely dispersed throughout the metropolitan area, and most people work and live far from the center. However, in contrast, in the heyday of the monocentric city, between two-thirds and three-fourths of jobs were near the center. Um, Jobs inside and outside the central area. The central city of a metropolitan area is defined as the large central municipality. In other words, the boundary of a central city is a political, not economic boundary. The typical metropolitan area has many other municipalities. These other municipalities comprise the suburban area and the rest of the metropolitan area. Um, in this table, this is in the United States. It shows the number of metropolitan jobs inside and outside central cities. So in the 1980s, we can see here that central cities, they had about 11% more jobs. But between 1980 and 2000, the central cities, as compared to other municipalities, grew slower. And by 2000, the central cities had 10% fewer jobs. And this trend is actually a continuation of a long trend of employment decentralization. And in 1948, central cities had roughly twice as many jobs as the other metropolitan municipalities. And this is in the United States. Okay, and jobs inside and outside the central area still. So we can also distinguish between a fixed central area and the rest of the metropolitan area. So for the largest 100 metropolitan areas in the United States, roughly 22% of jobs are within 3 miles of the center, and 65% of jobs are within 10 miles of the center. And the median location, which indicates where half of jobs are closer and half are farther away, is 7 miles. Employment subcenters, agglomeration economies. Um, Sorry, hold on, I cannot read it. Agglomeration economies encourage firms to locate close to one another, and one manifestation of clustering is a subcenter. A subcenter is an area where employment density is at least 25 workers per hectare, and total employment is at least 10,000 workers. And together, the subcenters contain 23% of the metropolitan employment, leaving about two-thirds of employment as dispersed outside the center and the subcenters. And we have edge cities. These are relatively new concentrations of office and retail space. And the total office space as the defining uh, total office space is the defining characteristic of an edge city, using the threshold of 5 million square feet. Um, Edge cities are distinguished from other subcenters by their more recent development. And what are the role of subcenters in the metropolitan economy? Subcenters are numerous in both new and old large metropolitan areas. And the second is in most metropolitan areas, most jobs are dispersed rather than concentrated in central business districts and subcenters. Many subcenters are highly specialized, indicating the presence of large localization economies. Subcenters have not eliminated the importance of the main center. In 7 of the 13 cities studied by Lang, the ratio of the central business district office space to the space in the largest subcenter is at least 4. So in the US, the metropolitan areas with the largest central business district subcenter ratios are New York. The ratio is 32, and Chicago, the ratio is 12. And Detroit is the only metropolitan area with a ratio less than 1. In the typical metropolitan area, employment density, um, which is measured by jobs per hectare, decreases as distance from the center increases, even though the center contains a relatively small share of the total employment. And firms in subcenters interact with the center, and the value of access to firms in the center is reflected in higher land prices near the center. Lastly, firms in different subcenters interact, indicating that subcenters have different functions and are complementary. So what is the economic relationship between a central business district and the surrounding subcenters and dispersed firms? The central business district provides better opportunities for the face time required for the production of services, such as advertising, accounting, legal counsel, and investment banking. Although advances in telecommunications have reduced the need for some types of interaction, face time is still required to exchange complex and tacit information as well as to establish trust. Um, yeah, so this is the special spatial distribution of population. Um, for the United States metropolitan areas as a whole, 36% of people live in central cities, and the remaining 64% live in other municipalities. For the largest 100 metropolitan areas, 20% of people live within 3 miles of the center, and 65% live within 10 miles of the center. The median residential location is 8 miles from the city center, 1 mile beyond the median location for employment. So this means that, in other words, the urban population is a bit more decentralized than urban employment, which was discussed earlier. Um, yeah, so population density here means still on spatial distribution of population. Um, Population density refers to the number of residents per hectare. So still this is in the US. So Portland, a state in the US, its population density has reached its highest level in the central area, with a top density of 91 per hectare. On the other hand, Boston, the population density reached its maximum at 420 per hectare. That's 107,760 per square mile near the center. Um, the price of land generally decreases as we move away from the city center, reflecting, sorry, reflecting the superior accessibility of central locations. As a result, people living close to the center economize on land, leading to higher population density. And the density gradient, it is defined as a percentage change in density per additional mile from the city center. So an example is given here. For example, if the density gradient for Boston is 0.13, this means that population density decreases by 13% for each additional mile from the city center. So for most large metropolitan areas in the United States, the density gradient is in the range 0.05 to 0.15, meaning that the gradient usually is means that it decreases by population density decreases by 5% for each additional mile from the city center, and the other end of the range, the upper bound is population density decreases by 15% for each additional mile from the city center. Density in world cities. So urban density is the total population of a metropolitan area divided by the amount of land in urban use, including residential areas, industrial districts, commercial areas, roads, schools, and city parks. This is called a built-up density as opposed to residential density. And Asian cities are at the top of the density list, and US cities are at the bottom. So next, okay, so this figure shows that it shows the urban density in selected cities around the world. So we have here Mumbai, Hong Kong, Guangzhou, Seoul, Bangalore, Moscow, Barcelona, Yerevan, Abi, Abidjan, Jakarta, Singapore, Tunis, Rio de Janeiro, Mexico City, Sofia, Paris, Warsaw, Buenos Aires, up to Atlanta. I mean, the US cities here on the right side, Los Angeles, Chicago, San Francisco, Portland, Houston, and Atlanta. Um, so we can see here that Asian cities are at the top of the density list. They're on the left side with the highest bars, and on the right side are the US cities. And in the US, New York is the densest US metropolitan area, yet its density is about half of the density of Paris and one-fourth of the density of Barcelona and one-tenth of the density of Mumbai, formerly known as Bombay. Um, okay. We move on to commuting patterns. The most frequent commuting trip is between two municipalities um, outside the central city. This is in the US. So here we have a graph, pie chart. So we have here the one with the biggest share, 44% within suburbs. The next is 29% within central city. The third one is a suburb to central city, which accounts for 19%. and the central city to suburb 8%. So as shown here, about 44% of commuter trips occur outside the central city, while 29% are within central cities. And for commuting between central cities and other municipalities, 19% of commuters live outside the central city and commute to the central city, and 8% do the reverse commute. This is in the United States. Okay, now we move on to we look at the rise of the monocentric city. So at the start of the 20th century, jobs were concentrated near the city center. Manufacturing firms located close to the railroads, terminals, and ports to economize on the cost of transporting inputs and outputs within the city. Office firms clustered in the CBD to facilitate the rapid exchange of information. Workers either lived near the central city and commuted by foot or rode streetcars from suburbs to the city center. So the um, the Industrial Revolution generated a series of innovations in intracity in transportation that decrease commuting costs. So this is one of the factors that contributed to the rise or the emergence of the monocentric city. So before 1820s, most urban travel was by foot, although a few wealthy people traveled by private horse-drawn carriage. But beginning in the late 1820s, innovations in transportation included the following. The first one is the omnibus, 1827. This is an horse-drawn wagon introduced in New York. It was the first public transit mode. The second one is the cable cars, introduced in 1873. These are steam-powered cable cars, which were introduced in San Francisco and spread to other cities. The third is the electric trolley. The fourth is the subway. And these innovations in interest, I mean, yeah, decreased commuting costs and increased the visible radius of cities. One rule of thumb is that the radius of a city is the distance that can be traveled in an hour. In the walking city of the early 19th century, the maximum radius was about 2 miles. And this series of innovations in intracity transport increased travel speeds and increased the visible radius of cities. And also the design of the public transit systems of the 19th century facilitated the large concentrations of employment near city centers. And these were hub and spoke systems, with spokes radiating out from a central hub. And all right, so the next, which um, contributed or brought about the rise of the monocentric city, is the technology of building construction. Before, another limit to city size comes from the costs of building high density housing to accommodate workers. And um, there was an innovation in the form of, um, I mean, the balloon frame building. So the balloon frame building, which was introduced in 1832, used smaller pieces of lumber fastened by nails using less skilled labor. Um, the critical element in the spread of these balloon frame building was the introduction of inexpensive manufactured nails. Before they were introduced in the 1830s, handcrafted nails were expensive enough to be listed as valued possession in wills. So, the combination of the balloon frame and also the inexpensive manufactured nails has decreased the cost of urban building significantly and substantially, which contributed to the growth monocentric cities. Um, the next one is the primitive technology of freight. Um, the advancement in the technology of freight transportation um, has enabled people to break free from the costly part of the transportation system, which used to tie manufacturers to the central export node, which is a railroad terminal or port. Okay. Next is the demise of the monocentric city. So, what caused the demise of the monocentric city with its large concentration of employment in the central area? The first one is the decentralization of manufacturing, the introduction of trucks and highways. So, the truck, um, sorry, hold on. The truck provided an alternative to the horse-drawn wagon used for the trip from factory to port or rail terminal. The truck was, of course, twice as fast as a horse-drawn wagon and half as costly. So manufacturers started using it for intercity transport, and improvements in the truck made long-distance travel feasible. And the expansion of the intercity highway system facilitated intercity truck traffic. Eventually, the truck became competitive with the train and the ship for intercity freight. As manufacturers switched from trains and ships to trucks, they were freed from their dependence on the railroads, and ports in city centers, and they moved to sites which are accessible to intercity highways. So in modern cities, manufacturers can locate close to highways and beltways to get easy access to interstate system. Other factors that led to the demise of the monocentric city. So in a modern, sorry, auto-based city, production sites along highways and beltways are accessible to the metropolitan workforce. So firms have more location options, including suburban locations. The switch from the traditional multi-story plans of the 19th century to a modern single-story plans increased the relative attractiveness of suburbs where land prices are lower. So an increase in the importance of air freight caused firms to locate near suburban airports. And for some firms, the suburban airport has replaced the port as the point of orientation. Um, the next, um, the next Reason, no. The next cause, I mean the next um is the centralization of office employment. So before the early 1970s, most offices or office firms located in the central business district, excuse me, because the central location facilitated FaceTime with other office firms. There were some suburban office activity, but most of it involved back office operations and rather than information exchange. So for most office activities, the advantages of a central business district location, um, w- which such as timely contact with other firms, outweigh the disadvantages like high wages and rents. However, in the recent years, we can see that advances in communications technology have allowed more office activities to be performed outside the central business districts. The electronic transmission of information allows workers to exchange a wider variety of information without face time, and firms can decouple their operations with information processing in the suburbs and activities requiring face time in the central business district. So, for example, a company can, I mean, like for example, a company's accountants can locate in the suburbs and transport reports through email to executives who are in the central business district, who then use the reports in their interactions with other firms. The next one is the decentralization of population. So this one also led to the demise of the monocentric city. Um, uh, the population density gradient can be used, I mean, which is defined as the, yeah, like we already defined this a while back as the rate at which population density decreases with distance. This can be used to document the suburbanization of, I mean, suburbanization of population. So yeah, a smaller gradient indicates that density decreases less rapidly with distance, and sorry, excuse me, population is less centralized. Um, in the U.S., its density gradient have been decreasing for the past 120 years. The decentralization of metropolitan population is a worldwide phenomenon. In cities throughout the world, population has been shifting outward away from the city center. And what contributed to the decentralization of population over the last several decades? Well, one factor is rising income. The demand for housing increases when with higher income, and because, excuse me, and because high housing prices are generally lower in suburban areas, rising income increases the relative attractiveness of suburban locations. Of course, we know that locating in suburban location would increase the opportunity cost of commuting. Excuse me. Um, Increasing the relative attractiveness of locations close to workplace. So it is not clear in theory whether higher income leads to more distant residential locations, but there is evidence that income growth encourages suburbanization. So another factor um is lower commuting costs. A decrease in commuting costs decreases the relative cost of living far from the city center, contributing to suburbanization. Um, in addition, the suburbanization of jobs and people reinforces one another. Jobs follow workers to the suburbs, and workers follow jobs to the suburbs. Another factor is old housing. The deterioration of central city housing encourages households to go to the suburbs where most of the houses are newer than those in the central business district. The second, another reason is central city fiscal problems. So many central cities have relatively high taxes, encouraging households to move to low tax suburbs. And next is crime. So most central cities obviously have relatively high crime rates, which encourages households to move to the suburbs. And lastly, education. Suburban schools are often considered superior to central city schools, thereby motivating or encouraging households to relocate to the suburbs. Okay. Moving on to urban sprawl. So as the city's population increases, the city can grow up by building taller buildings, or it can grow out by occupying more land. The people concerned about urban sprawl suggest that that there is too little up and too much out. Um, the footprint of the typical metropolitan area increased more rapidly than its population, so urban density it decreased. Some sprawl facts. One measure of urban sprawl is the density of economic activity. The lower the density, the larger the land area required to accommodate a given population, and the greater the spread or sprawl of the metropolitan area. US cities, like we've seen earlier, are much less dense than cities in the rest of the world. Yeah, it's much less denser than cities also from Asia. Um, yes, okay, including cities in Europe with similar education and income levels. So metropolitan areas in Germany are 4 times as dense as the United States metropolitan areas, and Frankfurt is 3 times as dense as New York City. Living at a low, sorry, living at a low density means consuming a large quantity of land, and we know that land is a normal good. So the higher the income, the larger the consumption of land and the lower the population density. And the second factor is the low cost of travel, which allows workers and shoppers to live relatively long distances from jobs, shops, and destinations for social interaction. Excuse me. This land is cheaper, so lot sizes are larger and population density is lower. So when we put these two factors together, high income and low cost of travel, excuse me, um, And this would allow people to move to the suburbs where land is relatively cheap. So we get low density development at distant locations, also known as urban sprawl. Cultural uh, differences, sorry. Um, we ask if there is a cultural dimension to urban density and sprawl, and there's a certain study that suggests, excuse me, there's a study by Berthold, I think, and Malpezzi in 2003, which suggested that cultural differences explain some of the dramatic differences in urban density across world cities. Asia has much higher urban density than other continents, much higher than could be explained by other factors such as income. Similarly, the variation in density across other continents could reflect differences in preferences for living space. So, in the United States metropolitan areas, the presence of immigrants tend to increase density, suggesting that culture is relevant. Excuse me. A number of government policies in the United States have actually encouraged low densities in large metropolitan areas. Like, for example, for congestion externalities, um, so people who use streets and highways during the peak travel period slow other drivers down, imposing an external cost. This underpricing of urban transportation encourages people to, um, commute relatively long distances from locations far from the city center, where the cost of land is low and the lot sizes are very large. I mean, relatively large. Next, policy that encouraged low densities in the US is the mortgage subsidy. Um, so in the US, interest on housing mortgages is a deductible expense for federal and state income taxes, thus providing a subsidy for housing that increases housing consumption. Land and housing are complementary goods, so the mortgage subsidy increases lot sizes and decreasing density. Next is the underpricing of fringe infrastructure. In some metropolitan areas, the infrastructure cost of new development at the urban fringe is not fully borne by developers and the customers. Many states in the US used development fees, like impact fees, to impose the cost of fringe development on developers and their commuters. Lastly, zoning. Many suburban municipalities use zoning to establish a minimum lot sizes. And one of the motivation, I think, is to exclude some like low income households or those that whose contribution are below what was um than the costs that are being provided by the government in terms of services, or if the costs they imposed are higher than the tax that they are paying. Okay, so European policies various public policies um, that promote higher urban density in European cities. So these so here as I mean no not here. So in Europe there are various public policies and they're the following. Excuse me. The first one is higher cost of personal transportation. um because of high taxes, the price of gasoline in Italy is roughly four times the price in the US. Another factor is the policy of heavier taxes on consumption rather than income. So sales taxes on cars sold in Europe are much higher than in the US. Excuse me, and nine times higher in the Netherlands and 37 times higher in Denmark. Other policies that um, include the small neighborhood shops that facilitate high density urban living. So since electricity is expensive in Europe, it would be very costly to operate huge refrigerators that allow Americans to make infrequent trips to suburban mega stores or malls. So as a result, most Europeans they depend on they make frequent trips to neighborhood stores, and also um, many European countries they restrict the pricing and location of large retailers because they are protecting the small shops from competition or from running out of business. So yeah, the result is more neighborhood shops and higher prices for consumers. Mm, yeah, so the next one is large agricultural subsidies that allow small farmers on urban fringes to outbid city dwellers for land. Um, and yeah, the subsidy per hectare was $791 dollars in the European Union in 1995 compared to only $79 in the US. Okay, the next policy which encourage higher density living in Europe is the investment in transportation infrastructure, which favors mass transit rather than highways. Um, so Britain and France, they allocate between 40% and 60% of their transport investment to mass transit networks as compared to 17% only in the United States. So that's 40 to 60% against 17% of transport investment to mass transit networks. All right, so we move on to the consequences of sprawl. So one is compared to the typical central city household, a suburban household requires 58% more land. That's 1,167 square meters versus 739. Excuse me. And next is that a suburban household actually consumes about the same. Okay, sorry. No. The next one is that A suburban household drives about 30% more than a central city household. So low density means more travel. A 10% decrease in density increases vehicle miles by 3.6%. And vehicle miles traveled have continued to increase while average fuel efficiency has decreased. So greenhouse emissions have continued to rise. So in the United States, counties that experience urban growth lost agricultural land, but the effect was relatively small. So for the United States counties as a whole, the elasticity of farmland acreage with respect to population is 0.02, meaning a 10% increase in population causes a 0.2% decrease in farmland. Um, okay, the next consequence is that providing mass transit in low density areas entails a lot of associated challenges. So mass transit is feasible only if density around bus stops or transit stations is high enough to attract a sufficient number of riders. So for most people, the maximum walking time to a transit stop is about 10 minutes. So a transit stop can serve households within an 800-meter radius. Policy responses to sprawl. Excuse me. There are many factors behind urban sprawl. Um, a number of public policies contribute to urban sprawl, and the appropriate um, response is to eliminate these distortions. So would land use patterns change by a little or a lot? So if the relatively low density in US cities results in large part from high income to low transport costs and strong preferences for space, eliminating the policy distortions won't change any density very much. But if the distortions from congestion externalities, mortgage subsidies, underpricing of fringe infrastructure, and large lot zoning are significant, we would expect larger changes in density. An alternative approach is to adopt anti-sprawl policies such as urban growth boundaries and development taxes. Okay, so moving on to the last section, are skyscrapers too tall? um, so like what we mentioned earlier, a high price of land generates tall buildings as firms substitute capital for relatively expensive land. So does the high price of land fully explain the massive skyscrapers in modern cities? So there was actually this modern recent study suggesting that skyscrapers result from competition between firms for the tallest building in the city. And the competition to be the tallest building reduces efficiency and profits. Okay. And also, it leads to inefficiently tall buildings. I think that ends my report. The reference I used is um, the book by O'Sullivan, Urban Economics 8th edition. Yeah, and thank you so much for listening.